Namaste. Today is the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. We have heard and read about the protests and the massacre, but the entire episode and its significance has been lost over time. And as we know, China has not only hidden the details of the protest and the massacre from its own people, but continues to force its narrative elsewhere in the world. It forces media houses and governments across the world to peddle its narrative to coercion and favors. We know that even to this day, China continues to trample on democracy in regions under its control. And somewhere it seems like China has been given a free hand to continue to do what it's doing. So, on this 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, we have Dr. Sriparna Pathak to discuss the details surrounding the massacre, related issues, what led to it, and most importantly, why is it important for us to know about the massacre. I welcome Dr. Sriparna Pathak. Introducing Dr. Sriparna Pathak, she is an associate professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs of OP Jindal University, Haryana, India. She teaches courses on foreign policy of China as well as theories of international relations. She has previously worked at Guwahati University and Don Bosco University as a consultant for the Policy Planning and Research Division of India's Ministry of External Affairs. She worked on China's domestic and foreign policies. She has also been associated with think tanks like Observer Research Foundation and South Asia Democratic Forum in Brussels, where she is a research fellow. She has worked as a researcher at the Center of Armed Forces Historical Research in New Delhi. She has also served as a board member of the Center for South Asian Studies of Guwahati University. Welcome, Dr. Sriparna Pathak.
So much for the warm welcome.
Yeah. So, Dr. Sriparna, my first question to you is, to educate us on what actually happened on June 4th during the Tiananmen Square massacre. And it would also help if you can elucidate on what led to the month-long protests leading to the massacre and what motivated the demonstrators then.
So, thank you so much. On June 4th, there was this thing called Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, the rest of the world calls it massacre, but China calls it the June 4th incident. Here, what is notable to point out is the nomenclature which it uses. When it says June 4th incident, it sounds like it was just an incident, nothing, it's not a big deal. But
Yeah.
to be honest, it was a massacre. It is the Tiananmen Square massacre. The background to this is that in the spring of 1989, thousands of students held demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, and they were demanding some sort of democratic reforms and an end to corruption. Just before this happened in 1989, what was happening in China is that there were major economic reforms. And because of these reforms, there was a lot of economic prosperity, which in turn led to commercialization. Feng Xiaoping had talked about to get rich is glorious. This was his philosophy. So, following this, a lot of farming practices had been shifted from traditional communes back to individual family farming, and a lot of mandates of what was happening under Mao Zedong that was changed under Deng Xiaoping. But what happened is that because of the shift in wealth, there was also an increasingly contentious gap between the rich and the poor. Many segments of the society, which earlier was very disenfranchised during the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong, because of these small reforms which were taking place within China, they thought that they can now have a forum to vent their frustrations. A lot of workers and peasants had also taken part in the Tiananmen Square, which concerned the party leadership. By 1980s, a lot of Chinese people they were getting frustrated with this corruption which they saw within the Chinese Communist Party. Just an example of this corruption is that highly ranked officials in the Communist Party, mostly party leaders and their children, they had invested in the joint ventures which China had brokered with foreign companies, and they were benefiting. And these benefits were not equally distributed across the country. It was mostly, the benefits were being reaped by people in the party holding high positions. So, for the general population, it looked like the rich and powerful were getting more rich and powerful, and the common man or the common woman was being locked out of the economic reform. The more immediate cause was the death of this leader called Hu Yaobang. Hu Yaobang was one of the very few leaders who was viewed as incorruptible, and his death happened in 1989. And his death was the last straw which galvanized this Tiananmen Square massacre. What happened is that people gathered to genuinely mourn his death. And Hu Yaobang, he had held the top office of the Communist Party of China from 81 to 87. He was first as the chairman between 1981 to 82. Then he became the general secretary from 82 to 87. And he is so important because he was responsible for ensuring that the Communist Party apparatus actually carries out policy directives of China's new leadership. He was responsible for downgrading, the Maoist ideology, which had eaten away China from within, and he wanted to replace it with a more flexible and pragmatic policy. So, there were some sort of protests which were happening at a low scale in 1987 in January, and these were student protests, and they were demanding, some sort of freedoms, basic freedoms. That's what they were demanding. When this happened, a clique of party elders and senior military officials, they forced Hu Yaobang to resign on the grounds that he had been too lenient with student protesters, and that he was moving too quickly towards free market style economic reforms. So he was actually, bidding to free China from the bounds of Marxist and Maoist ideology. So when he actually died, public mourning, it snowballed into several weeks of student-led pro-democracy protests. There were hunger strikes as well, which finally ended with a very bloody military crackdown on June 4th. Um,
Oh,
Hu Yaobang's death, corruption within the party, desire for some amount of freedom is what led to these protests. Also, another reason was that Gorbachev was supposed to visit Tiananmen Square. So the international media was present at the Tiananmen Square. The Communist Party leadership did not want this to be broadcasted to the rest of the world and it becoming, an embarrassment for China, which is why the urgency to crack down. And well, they did crack down, and the rest is history. It was simply a massacre.
yeah, extension of this, what actually happened on that day? Because whether it's Wikipedia or other articles, we see there's some amount of sanitization done on what exactly happened, and even today, uh, except what we call as conspiracy theories, not really much is available in the academic circles, like what actually happened on that day. So I would just like to know if you can educate us on what, I mean, why did they decide on such a brutal military action? And we have seen that tanks and a single person standing in front of the tank and all that. So what led to that? And were there similar protests during that time, or even just after the June 4th, which were put down similarly?
So, this had started quite early on. June 4th was like, the final nail in the coffin. But if you go back to the month of May, on May 13th, for example, a number of student protesters, they initiated a hunger strike, right? And this hunger strike inspired similar other strikes all across China. Why were these students protesting? They were protesting because, when Tang Xiaoping started his reforms, it was envisaged or it was imagined that people will actually get a lot of opportunities. But these students were arguing that China's educational system did not adequately prepare them for an economic system with elements of free market capitalism. So they wanted that, which is why they were protesting. And other people, other students across the country saw logic in that, which is why they protested. Now, as this movement started growing, the Chinese government became increasingly uncomfortable with the protests because it was disrupting a visit by Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev, which was due on May 15th. And as I said as an answer to the last question, there was a presence of international media also. So,
Right.
faced with the fear that this protest will escalate into a revolution, the party cracked down. There was a welcome ceremony for Gorbachev, which was originally scheduled for Tiananmen Square. It was instead held at the airport, right? Um,
Okay.
Even so, the demonstration still had to be curtailed. The Chinese government therefore declared martial law on May 20th, and there were about 250,000 troops which entered Beijing. By the end of May, there were more than 1 million protesters still, and more people were still joining. So they held daily marches, vigils, and these images got transmitted by the media all across the globe. When the initial presence of the military it failed to quell the protests, the Chinese authorities decided to increase the aggression. And finally, at 1 a.m. on June 4th, Chinese soldiers and police stormed Tiananmen Square and fired live rounds. Why is there a sanitization of this issue in academia? Because the Chinese Communist Party simply does not allow any sort of discussion, or even if you are within China, this is first hand experience from when I was in China. You use Paitu, which is their version of Google,
Yeah. Good.
and you try to search for Tiananmen. The Chinese version of error 404 will come up, not found simply. That is the level of sanitization which happens. So clearly there is no discourse, and even if you try to talk to the younger people or anyone in China, there is so much of surveillance that these people will simply either say that they don't want to talk about it, or they will toe the government line, because let's agree, no one wants to really lose their lives or the lives of their loved ones. So that is the level, and because over the years China has been able to use its iron fist to push its narrative down that this was just an incident, there has not been much discourse. There's a lot of discourse in Western countries. There are some of these snippets from Western journalists covering these incidents, or from some of the Chinese protesters as well. In fact, even in India, there was a group of students from India as well who had marched up to the Chinese embassy. And we had, like, these students had also talked about the freedom for Chinese students. There is a lot of discourse in other parts of the world, but within China, it's all hush hush. Every year on June 4th, the surveillance increases multiple times. Even before June 4th, it increases multiple times, so that there is no commemoration. Most of the articles and everything, they used to come out earlier from Hong Kong or from Taiwan. But now, because of China's increased surveillance, or because of their laws, national security law, which they're imposing on Hong Kong, there's going to be a sanitization even there. So, to come back to your question, the Chinese government did try to instill some fear by just positioning the troops there first. But when that did not work, the next step was simply to, announce or to order live firing.
I read that even this time, group of students who were trying to take out a protest last week. I think they were arrested, or the protest was disbanded in Hong Kong. I suppose. So, yeah. Just to get the perspective of what happened then and what's happening now, what was the international response? And as a scholar, do you think it was adequate? And how did various governments, including India, react? And how did global media houses, cover these protests and the massacre after? I mean, during the protest and after. I mean, basically, do you think it was adequate, or and even the governmental or UN in the response by United Nations, was it adequate? And what kind of response was there?
Okay, so the international response to the massacre was varied. It was different in Asian countries, it was different in Western countries. The US's response, for example, would be very different from, say, the Indian response, um, or say even from the United Nations response. So, coming first to the response of, say, the United Nations, it was inadequate to say the least. And why do I say it was inadequate? Because it was considered as an internal Chinese political issue. Secretary General Javier Perez de Suela at that time, he was concerned about the incident, but he also noted that the UN Charter prohibits interference in member states' internal affairs, especially member states with a Security Council veto. So what happened is, Between August and September 89, this subcommission on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities, it held a meeting, right? And there was a meeting resolution 1989 by 5, which was adopted by a secret ballot in 1989 August. This resolution, it talked about the situation in China, and it said that the committee was concerned about what had occurred in China, and that it would have implications on the future of human rights. The resolution, basically, in very short, crisp terms, it had just 2 points: that the Secretary General should transmit to the Commission on Human Rights, whatever information is provided by the government of China and by other reliable sources, and to make an appeal for clemency in favor of people deprived of their liberty as a result of the above mentioned events. But this was a very watered down response.
Right.
There was massive human rights violation. So just talking about, just appealing for clemency, it doesn't carry much weight. Or just talking about requesting the Security General to transmit to the Commission information received from China, this is not adequate. The Chinese
Right.
state was the one which was cracking down on human rights. So the United Nations response was, very, very disappointing, to say the least. Um, the US response was a little more, it had a little more teeth, at least, because it criticized, this entire crackdown. It criticized human rights violations. Um, that at least was better. Leaders from across the globe, including Gorbachev, condemned the military action. And the US Congress, they voted to impose an economic sanction against China, citing human rights violations. This was the US response, which was at least better than the United Nations response. It had some tooth to it. Coming to the Indian response, many Asian countries, they remained silent throughout the protests, and our government as well. We responded to the massacre by ordering state television to, tone down the coverage to the barest minimum, so as to not jeopardize a thawing in relations with China. And
Okay.
it was said that, there should be political empathy which should be given to the events. However, at the level of, the people, the masses in India, the ones who knew about it, were enraged. So, for example, there was a group of students which I was talking about from JNU, which marched to the Chinese embassy, and police surrounded this group. But these people, the students, they shouted for Chinese students movement. They said things like "Tankist, Punksists, down, down." Foreign media was swarming the place. This was covered, and they stuck petitions of several sheets on the gates of the Chinese embassy. These images, they went viral on international television. So that was a kind of response from India, at the government level and at the level of the students. But largely, Asian countries chose to remain silent. So this is something which was actually very sad, because it goes a long way into emboldening China. The whole fact that there's a sanitization about, or there's a lack of voice, or there's a lack of adequate coverage of what actually happened, stems from this sort of response. It just emboldened them further, that this has happened. It can be forced down the throats of other countries, or international organizations.
I mean, the purpose of asking the question was that, I mean, if you conflate with what is happening today, it sounds very similar. And, since 3 decades have passed, I mean, nothing such major incidents have happened in the mainland China, other than what happened in Hong Kong. So all this, if not condemnation, at least the international response, did it have any effect on the Chinese leadership? And particularly, were there any changes within the CCP or the Chinese administration after this, the protest and the massacre?
So, it's, as I said, it's because of the response which was shown to them that they got emboldened. If we look at the concentration camps, which they called re-education camps, which are in Xinjiang, the UN had taken cognizance of these reports of lakhs and lakhs of Uyghur Muslims being incarcerated in these camps. But it had just said that they had used the term warisam. very similar to what the response was in 1989. There has to be a condemnation, it cannot just be worrisome. It, of course, is worrisome. Human rights violations of this scale. So, 1989 itself emboldened China that it can do these things, which is why it is continuing to do these things. Hong Kong protests, fair enough. There are these diplomatic clashes with UK or US. There are these criticisms from the Western world largely. But beyond that, what? So China clearly goes unpunished every single time. And the courage to do so, it goes a long way back to 1989. Because even at that time when China wasn't so powerful, that is the kind of response that the world had. So right now when China is powerful, it definitely knows that the response has to be further toned down. What were the changes which happened in the CCP? The Chinese regime has just become more repressive since 1989. After Tiananmen, the Communist Party reshuffled the top leadership. After the suppression of dissidents in Beijing and other cities, many liberal reformers were removed. They got replaced by conservatives. Many political reforms, such as introducing more intra-party competition, all of these ended after Tiananmen. Now, the post-Tiananmen regime in China became much more repressive, and this is reflected in the heightened power which was given to police chiefs and the skyrocketing police spending. Over the last these many decades, Chinese domestic security apparatus has expanded dramatically, and this thing, stability maintenance, which is a government euphemism for repressing collective protests, it became a top priority for Chinese authorities. Chinese leadership since Tiananmen, even so more under Xi Jinping, has been very keen to prevent and preempt any political or social protests which might go the Tiananmen way. So it just means that earlier, it was these students who got actually massacred. It was easy to get into Tiananmen, but if you go to Tiananmen now, again, speaking from first-hand experience, there are lots of guards. It's not very easy to get into Tiananmen. You can just move outside it. It's almost impossible to get into Tiananmen Square. Um, Protests are still happening, not at this scale, but there has been repression. And since we are living in this pandemic world order, and we are talking about vaccines. Even before the COVID vaccines have been a huge controversy in China because the vaccines are not really effective. I'll just give you an example. So there was a child, who got a vaccine the way we get our children vaccines. She got it from a public hospital, and she got paralyzed from her waist down. So the parents, of course, um, it's I do not even have words to express what the parents might have gone through. So the parents have been protesting ever since, and even there's this story. It's searchable. There's the mother. Her name is He Fangmei. She got arrested multiple times by the government, and she has been in unspoken lockups because the husband keeps looking for her. And after a year, she was released, and even after she was released, of course, she went back to protest again because seeing your child that way because of a mess up of of a vaccine from a government hospital is something which no mother can bear. She has been protesting, but every single time these people disappear, they get tortured, etc. So protests still are happening in China. In the rural landscape, protests are happening because of labor issues. Protests are happening because of environmental issues, but nothing of this scale or nothing of the scale which is happening in Hong Kong. Um, but because of the experience which China had in 1989, the surveillance has grown, which is why even when protests do happen, they remain very low scale. So, and all of this legacy or this preparedness for dealing with protests goes back to their experience from 1989.
And that shows, as you said, surveillance, and they become more protective and very vigilant of whatever happens within in the mainland, and of course now Hong Kong. So that brings to my next question. Like, we are in second year of uh, the pandemic which originated in China, and again it seems like China has been let off the hook. You know what happened to the WHO team? which visited China. So when we look back, if I can say, China has not paid for its crimes, the human rights abuses which it has done in on the mainland, whether it's Hong Kong and other places. So in the same line, on the 30th anniversary, there was a trend on Tiananmen Square, and there was a section which was saying like, why do you have to discuss now? Tiananmen Square is something which is past. It's almost 3 decades. So what is the significance? Pretty well remember that debate on Twitter. So if you can educate our watchers, like what are the lessons from Tiananmen Square that we must recall at the time of this pandemic, which has killed millions, and what are the lessons we draw from the protests itself? And basically, why is it important for us?
Right. See, first of all, this whole question of why should we discuss Tiananmen? History
Right.
is very important. China uses history. China never forgets its history. So why should we not discuss history? A history of this is a history regarding human lives. So why not? Why shouldn't this be discussed? So Tiananmen is something which remains a blotch on human history. Why should it not be discussed? And these people or these accounts which you will see on social media, which are talking about what is the need, they clearly are towing the government line, the Chinese CCP's line, Chinese Communist Party of China's line. China does invest a lot in these, people who would be sitting on social media sites, because China also has a very clear motive of influencing the narrative about itself, which is why it will take extra precautions so that this Chinese virus or Wuhan virus, as they themselves initially had called it, does not get called the Wuhan virus. Does
Exactly.
not get associated with China. See, even if we were to buy into the logic that viruses should not be named after the countries of their origin, fact remains that the Spanish influenza is still called the Spanish influenza. Japanese encephalitis is still called Japanese encephalitis,
Then,
etc., etc. These haven't been changed. And when the new strains also started coming out of the COVID-19 virus, they were named after the countries that they emanated from. But China would not want the original virus to be called by the. So, very clearly they have a focus on their narrative or the usage of nomenclature, which is why you will see a lot of these accounts on Twitter, even though Twitter is banned in China, or on any other social media sites, which would be trying to force the CCP's view down the international audience as well. Um, and why should we not discuss Tiananmen? Because human rights are still very important. Because, as much as China is authoritarian, the rest of the world still follows principles of liberal democracies, which is why human rights becomes important. And the entire way in which Tiananmen unfolded, in the way in which the world responded, has something to do in the way that China's appetite, or for China wanting to project its powers abroad, it grew. So which is why it is important that we go back to Tiananmen, we look at Tiananmen, because even if we were to move away from Tiananmen just for a second,
yes.
what exactly is happening in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, etc., etc. We do need to look at parallels from history. Where do we get the parallel from history? One example is definitely Tiananmen. So why not discuss Tiananmen? As people would want to safeguard and secure their own human rights, it is important that we do look at history. Also, when we do talk about punishments for crimes which have happened in the past, why not talk about the crimes which China has engaged in? Why only talk about the crimes of the Western world? I'm not saying that the US has not engaged in slavery, or that it is free from blame, or other countries have not engaged in rights abuses. All these countries are being discussed. Even right now, countries are coming up and apologizing for some of the historical sins. So why not China? You know, If China really wants to be the leader of the world, it should start acting like the leader of the world. It should start taking responsibility. It has never taken responsibility. This is exactly why the world should understand that because China doesn't take responsibility, be it for Tiananmen, be it for the Wuhan virus, be it for the incarcerations in Xinjiang, it
Right.
should never be upheld or looked upon as a leader of this 21st century IR. So, which is why Tiananmen has to be gone back to again and again to understand what lies in the future for us if China ever is to, hold the reins of power in the international system.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Sriparna. That was like, no other reasons are required to know why we need to know about what's happening in Tiananmen Square. Just one small question. Um, uh, we have seen how the media is covering the pandemic. Uh, After a year or so now, there's some kind of whitewash which is already happening. There's no more, especially the big media houses. Uh, what is that? The governments are being influenced by Chinese investments, and all the media houses are being influenced. Whether it's Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong, there are some reports here and there, more of incidents and less of analysis. So, what is it we can do to educate people, and will it help if we differentiate between the Chinese state, this is the CCP and its administration, and the people? When we analyze what's happening in China, will it help if we make this distinction, Chinese people and CCP and administration, or it doesn't matter?
It definitely
How
matters
do
because the
we go forward when we address the issues in China?
right. So, it does make a huge difference, and which is why we should, differentiate between the CCP and the people, because the Chinese people are also suffering. In one of the previous answers, I talked about this woman, her Fangmei, and her daughter, and the virus and the vaccine. So clearly, they are also suffering. These people who lost their lives in Tiananmen Square massacre, these people who are being incarcerated in Xinjiang, in these concentration camps in Tibet, in all across China. These political prisoners, um, definitely we need to make a difference. Therefore, even the effects of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was terrible for the Chinese people. Which is why a lot of scholars, a lot of students, a lot of academicians, risking their own lives, they went online, and they criticized the Chinese state. um, it was bad. A lot of
Right.
them, actually took photos from these hospitals and how there were no beds, and people were sprawling all over the floor. The state wasn't prepared, and they put it online, defeating the Chinese narrative that it has everything under control. So clearly, the Chinese people are also suffering, which is why there is a need to differentiate between the Chinese people and the state. How do we go about this? The first way is to bring out the narrative of the people, because what we hear from China is the state narrative, is that of the Chinese Communist Party. But if we could have more people who know the Chinese language, who have studied China's history, sociology, etc., etc., who can understand their the netizens plight or whatever they put out, if there's a little more mining of that, and if that can be brought out to the public all across the globe, then that makes a difference, because right now even they are being silenced. So it's very important, therefore, that we distinguish between the Chinese state, the CCP, and the people, because sadly enough, they are suffering the most because they are directly under, we at least, despite the fact that the world is suffering the effects of the Wuhan virus, um, we at
Yeah.
least are not being incarcerated, or we are not being imprisoned or tortured or punished. We're still away from the CCP.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Sriparna. In conclusion, like as you said, as China continues to grow in strength and expand its footprints, it's all the more important for the world, especially those in the immediate neighborhood, to be aware of China's machinations of whatever it's doing and its history. So, in that sense, we need to know what happened then 30 years ago, 32 years ago. And thank you very much. You have explained in detail. It was a detailed review of Tiananmen Square protest and massacre. So I thank you once again, and we look forward to you talking to us again, Dr. Sriparna.
Thank you so much. This was really a wonderful opportunity, and I totally enjoyed the questions. Thank you so much for having me.